Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Willow was no longer the delicate, vulnerable woman who once trembled under the weight of loss and betrayal. Her skin had thickened with sorrow, her heart grown weary after the devastating blow of losing custody of her children. The courtroom battles had drained her spirit, and the judgment passed down had torn a hole in the very fabric of her identity as a mother. Yet even as she summoned every ounce of strength to pull herself together, to walk upright again in a world that seemed to constantly shift beneath her feet, she found herself dragged into a new storm, one that was not forged by fate, but carefully orchestrated by the very people she had once dared to trust. Her trauma had not created this chaos. It had only made her more susceptible to manipulation. And the hands behind the chaos, as she would later discover, were not the enemies she had learned to fear, but the allies she had clung to in the darkness. When Drew presented her with a surprise proposal, it did not come on the heels of romance or reconciliation, but rather in the wake of a fierce confrontation with Jason about custody. The proposal felt less like a declaration of love and more like a strategic move in a game of power and optics. Willow hesitated. She didn't say no, but she didn't say yes. The scars on her soul were too fresh, the pain of being deemed an unfit mother still echoing in her chest. Her world had narrowed to legal deadlines, court-appointed visits, and the judgmental gazes of former family. Her sense of self had been torn apart by a system that never truly saw her, and now, standing before a man she thought she once knew, she questioned everything. What Drew offered wasn't comfort. It was a lifeline. And yet she didn't know whether he was pulling her out of the water or tightening the noose. It was Martin who tipped the scale. Martin, the attorney she had come to rely on with unwavering faith. He had been with her through the darkest of hearings, reassuring her when she crumbled, grounding her when she spiraled. She believed in his guidance because she believed in his empathy. He was calm, meticulous, persuasive, his words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they felt true. So when Martin told her that marrying Drew would strengthen her case, that the image of a united, responsible family would sit well with the judge, Willow listened. He spoke of legal strategy and family stability as if he were outlining a moral imperative. He said this marriage could tilt the scales, make the court see her not as a woman who had broken but one who had rebuilt. And Willow, desperate to feel whole again, to see her children wake up in her home again, believed him. What she didn't know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that Martin was no longer her advocate. Beneath the surface of his composed demeanor was a betrayal more intimate than any she had endured in court. Drew had gotten to him. Quietly. Discreetly. Power and money flowed behind the scenes, not in envelopes but in carefully disguised legal retainers, business opportunities, and whispered promises of influence. Drew had paid not just for Martin's legal expertise, but for his loyalty, and Martin had become an invisible architect in Drew's scheme to trap Willow in a marriage that served him far more than it ever would her. Back at home, Willow continued to drift through her days in a haze of exhaustion and confusion. When Drew returned from his run, he found her barely upright, her body moving out of habit more than will. Her mind was frayed. Under the quiet surface, she was falling apart, but hiding it beneath half-smiles and subdued nods. When Drew again brought up marriage, she didn't respond immediately, and that pause, so brief, was broken by Martin's timely arrival. Like a conductor stepping in just as the orchestra faltered, Martin smoothed the scene with strategic reassurance. He repeated his legal rationale. He invoked stability, public perception, the long-term benefit of creating a new family structure. He spoke as though Drew had nothing but noble intentions. Willow, already worn down by the constant weight of hope and failure, nodded. She agreed. And in a moment that would come to haunt her for the rest of her life, she leaned forward and kissed Drew, believing she was sealing a pact of healing, when in truth, she was signing herself into captivity. The ripple effects of that kiss were immediate. At the pool later that day, Michael sat in quiet restraint, watching Wiley swim, his eyes veiled in forced admiration as the boy joyfully recounted how Uncle Drew had shown him a new technique. Christina sat nearby, sensing Michael's turmoil, and gently reminded him that unchecked anger leads to irrevocable choices. She referenced Ava vaguely, hinting at past regrets, but offered no details. Michael listened, but the unease in his gut only grew. Something was off, too many things were off. And yet, as he gathered Wiley and left, he unknowingly left behind a symbol of innocence, Wiley's Lila's Kids t-shirt, forgotten on a poolside chair. Later, Willow arrived at the pool with Nina. Her purpose was clear, a fleeting, desperate hope of seeing Wiley, or at the very least, holding a piece of him. When she spotted the shirt, something in her shattered. She reached for it like a lifeline, but Nina intervened, urging her not to break the court's restrictions. Willow, trembling with grief and driven by the illusion that everything would soon change, revealed that she was getting married to Drew. The words were simple, but their weight was crushing. Nina froze. Time seemed to suspend between them. Because Nina knew what Willow did not, knew that the man Willow was about to bind her life to had shared more than confidences with her mother. She knew that Drew, behind his polished charm, had engaged in a secret, intimate affair with her. Nina had considered telling her daughter the truth before, had rehearsed the confession in sleepless nights and guilt-ridden mornings. But Drew had stopped her. He reminded her of Willow's fragile mental state, the delicate balance she was trying to maintain. He told her that Willow didn't need more pain, more complications. He painted himself as the last thread of stability in Willow's life, and Nina, afraid to tip the scale, stayed silent. But now, faced with her daughter's engagement, the price of that silence grew unbearable. She realized, too late, that by protecting Willow from the truth, she had allowed her to step blindly into a trap laid by the very man she should have feared most. Willow would eventually uncover the full scope of the betrayal. The chain of encrypted messages between Martin and Drew. The off-record meetings. The hidden retainer fees disguised through shell firms. Her entire reality. Her legal defense, her emotional support, her future, had been manipulated. Her trust, weaponized. The image of herself as a mother, a partner, and a fighter, had been used against her. And the man she had kissed in hope was, in truth, the man who had stolen everything she had left. That kiss had been a beginning, yes, but not the beginning of a new family. It was the first note in a requiem of everything she had once believed to be real. Willow had always been perceptive, but grief and trauma had clouded her judgment for far too long. However, in the weeks following her rushed marriage to Drew, that cloud began to lift, and with it came a chilling clarity. She began to notice discrepancies, not just in Drew's actions, but in the subtle shifts of tone, the strategically timed reassurances, the near-scripted phrasing that had characterized every interaction she'd had with Martin since the proposal. What had once felt like wise counsel now felt suspiciously rehearsed. The same phrases used by Drew echoed in Martin's legal advice, and the more she replayed their conversations in her mind, the more it became clear, these were not coincidences. Compelled by a gnawing sense of unease, Willow began to look deeper, telling herself she was just trying to understand. But what she found went far beyond anything she had feared. Hidden within a shared legal document folder. Something she accessed during a routine review of paperwork for her custody appeal, was a trace log of communications. It began innocently enough, a few missed calls between Martin and Drew, the kind that might pass as normal between two men involved in the same legal case. But then came the timestamps, matching up too neatly with key decisions in her case. And then came the real evidence. Encrypted messages with file attachments, unmarked payments made to an account connected to a consultancy firm that Martin had never disclosed, and a series of internal memos hinting at a strategy of containment, a phrase that had been used verbatim by Drew when discussing how to keep things calm before the custody hearing. Willow sat frozen, staring at the screen, her breath shallow. In that moment, 1,000 realizations collided at once. The firm but gentle nudge from Martin to consider how stable marriage might look to the court. The sudden change in Drew's tone from desperation to confidence. The timing of every legal decision, every push toward reconciliation, every warning against making emotional moves. It had all been planned. It had never been about helping her. It had been about securing Drew's place beside her, not out of love, but out of control. The man she thought was trying to build a future with her had instead used her trauma to craft a legal narrative in his favor, and the lawyer she trusted most had been his silent accomplice all along. The betrayal didn't just wound Willow, it enraged her. The pain of being manipulated was one thing, but the sheer audacity of being used as a pawn in a strategy to sway the court ignited something far more dangerous inside her. She would not be pitied. She would not remain the broken woman begging a system for mercy. Not anymore. With a newfound resolve hardening inside her, Willow made her decision. She would not be a victim of Drew's deception. She would be the one to expose him, and the first person she turned to was the woman whose silence had, until now, only added to the damage, Nina. The meeting between mother and daughter was not gentle. Willow didn't arrive in tears, she arrived with evidence. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with a fury Nina hadn't seen since the custody trial. She laid out the facts, the documents, the financial trail, and the proof that Martin had never been on her side. Then, with quiet intensity, she looked Nina in the eye and asked for help, not for comfort, but for justice. Nina didn't hesitate. Her guilt for having withheld the truth about Drew had become unbearable. She knew her silence had cost her daughter more than just heartbreak. It had cost her clarity, agency, trust. She owed Willow more than words. She owed her action. Driven by both guilt and maternal instinct, Nina mobilized every resource at her disposal. She contacted private investigators, dug into Martin's financial history, traced the shell company that had funneled the payments, and obtained metadata from Martin's legal workstation, data that, once extracted, revealed off-the-record edits to Willow's legal filings, many of which had favored Drew's positioning. Nina even managed to retrieve audio from a secure line, capturing part of a conversation where Drew and Martin discussed controlling optics and maintaining influence over the narrative. It was damning. And it was more than enough. The moment the evidence went public, the fallout was immediate. Martin, long hailed as one of the most composed and reputable attorneys in family law, was unmasked as a co-conspirator in one of the most unethical legal manipulations the family court had seen in years. His license was suspended pending investigation, and the Bar Association launched an inquiry into every custody case he had presided over in the past 5 years. The judge who had previously viewed Willow's case through a lens of doubt now stared at a woman who had been strategically undermined by the very people meant to defend her. But even as Martin's fall from grace captured headlines and Drew scrambled to maintain his public image, Willow refused to celebrate. This was not a victory. It was a reclamation. She hadn't destroyed Martin or Drew, she had dismantled the illusions they had constructed around her. She had stripped away the narrative that painted her as weak, unstable, or easily manipulated. She had reclaimed her voice, and more importantly, her sense of control. Her future in court was no longer dependent on persuasion or sympathy. It was built now on truth, on evidence, and on the undeniable fact that she had been wronged, and that she had fought back. The system that once loomed so large, so cold, now looked different. Not because it had changed, but because Willow had. And as she prepared for the next hearing, this time armed with the full weight of truth, she no longer felt like a woman begging for permission to be a mother. She was a mother who had earned the right to be heard. A woman who had been deceived, exploited, underestimated, and who had turned that betrayal into her greatest strength. Drew, once the man who seemed to hold every string of control in his carefully constructed web, now found those strings unraveling faster than he could grasp them. The mask of confidence he wore so effortlessly began to crack under the weight of unraveling secrets and shifting loyalties. His plan, so meticulously crafted, was crumbling beneath the weight of one undeniable force, truth. He had once believed that all it would take was Martin's calculated persuasion to steer Willow into submission. That once the marriage was solidified, she would serve the purpose he needed. A partner whose vulnerability would enhance his image, whose grief could be repurposed as a symbol of family restoration before the court. But Drew had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated what lived inside a mother who had been forced to let go of her children. He had overlooked the fire in a woman who had been betrayed too many times. And most of all, he had failed to account for the quiet strength of a heart that had learned to heal itself. Not for love, not for appearance, but for survival. For the first time in months, Willow no longer looked at him with softness or confusion. She saw him now with clarity, unflinching, unyielding. She didn't need him to tell her she was worthy. She didn't need his last name to be taken seriously in court. She didn't need his carefully rehearsed lines or his politically correct demeanor. What she needed, what she had always needed, was the truth. And now that she had it, that truth became a storm crashing through every illusion he had built. Drew had surrounded himself with mirrors reflecting back his preferred image, the supportive partner, the misunderstood hero, the father figure. But truth doesn't reflect illusions, it shatters them. And as Willow peeled back the layers of manipulation, betrayal, and coercion, everything Drew had worked for began to implode. He tried to reason, to regain the upper hand through appeals to emotion, through half-truths and desperate damage control. But none of it worked anymore. Willow was no longer the woman desperate for reassurance. She had become a force of reckoning, no longer moved by the theatrics of power. And worse for Drew, she had allies now, people who believed her, people who had seen the evidence, and people who had once turned away now rallying around her as she reclaimed her narrative. Every courtroom whisper, every article headline, every private message among Genoa's elite now centered not on Drew's leadership or charm, but on the growing scandal of his manipulation and the unraveling of his intentions. The public tide had turned, and Drew was no longer the steady figure the court respected. He was a liability, a question mark, a man clinging to relevance in a story that had shifted beneath him. The upcoming custody hearing, which he had once counted on as the final checkmate in his legal strategy, now loomed as a battlefield where the stakes were no longer about image, but about integrity. And Drew knew, deep down, that he would walk into that courtroom not as a man fighting for family, but as a man exposed. The very union he had forced into existence was now the most damning piece of evidence against him. Willow wouldn't be asking the court for the chance to mother her children again. She would be demanding it, with proof, with strength, and with the unapologetic voice of someone who had risen from beneath the crushing weight of deceit. Willow would not enter the courtroom in silence. She would walk in with purpose, not as a plaintiff pleading for mercy, but as a woman reclaiming what had been taken. Her eyes would not dart with uncertainty but hold steady with conviction. She would stand before the bench not to be saved, but to make sure that those who had tried to destroy her were finally seen for who they truly were. And when the time came, when all arguments had been made and the courtroom fell still, she would raise her voice, not with anger, but with the authority of truth, and she would point to Drew, to Martin, to every false protector who had cloaked themselves in the guise of justice, and she would say, I am not a victim. In a world where justice is too often shaped by wealth and whispered influence, Willow had become the one thing that couldn't be bought or bent, an unwavering light in a room built on shadows. She had become the symbol not only of maternal resilience, but of moral clarity. Her battle was no longer just about regaining custody, it was about dismantling the systems that allowed her pain to be manipulated. She stood now as the embodiment of defiance against corruption, of love that refused to be buried, and of a truth so fierce it could not be silenced. Drew, watching her from across the courtroom, could see it too. The control he thought he had. Gone. The image he worked so hard to project. Exposed. And the woman he once tried to mold into the perfect pawn. She was now the one holding the power. As she stood there, ready to confront a legal system that had once failed her, Willow wasn't just fighting for her children, she was becoming a lighthouse for every mother, every woman, every soul who had been gaslit, manipulated, and betrayed. And this time, she would not lose.